Hey, wait! I need a guide. Teach me your ways!
Many of you asked me to make a leveling guide for the Smith of Kitava shield wall build. I'm very glad you liked the build and want to understand how to level it properly. In this video, I will show you the leveling process step by step as if this is your first league start in Path of Exile 2. We will focus on a smooth and comfortable progression from the early acts all the way into endgame maps. If you're looking for a specific act, want to know how to start the endgame, or already have the build and want to improve your damage, you can use the timestamps to jump straight to the part you need. I want to clarify one important thing first. I am not very experienced with solo self-found leveling. Because of that, starting from Act 4, I will use the trade market to buy a few necessary items. Before Act 4, we only use basic gear that can be easily found during leveling. So, we start the game as a warrior. We get our first skill gem and kill the first boss. In the encampment, we receive our second skill gem. Here, we choose Bone Shatter. At this point, we already have a simple but effective skill combo for clearing the campaign. Let me quickly explain how this combo works. Rolling Slam has 2 hits. The first hit has much higher stun buildup, while the second hit deals more damage. So for us, only the first hit matters. We use it to prepare enemies for a stun. Once enemies are ready to be stunned, we use Bone Shatter to finish them quickly. After stunning an enemy with Bone Shatter, you create a strong aftershock. This aftershock deals high damage to nearby enemies. With your first support gem, you further increase this effect. Next, it is very important to find a two-handed mace. We will use a weapon swap setup. For the first hit, we use a one-handed mace only to prepare enemies for a stun. It's perfect for this because it has higher attack speed and lower damage. This helps us avoid killing enemies before we can use Bone Shatter. So here is the setup. Rolling Slam is assigned to the weapon set with the one-handed mace, while the Bone Shatter is assigned to the weapon set with the two-handed mace. This makes the combo smooth and very reliable for leveling. But be careful with your weapon damage. At some point, your one-handed or two-handed mace may become too strong and start killing enemies in a single hit. If that happens, it makes sense to replace it with a weaker weapon in Rolling Slam's set. On the other side, if your mace can no longer stun enemies with the first hit, you should replace it with a stronger one. For boss fights, we use the default attack, Mace Strike. This may sound counterintuitive, but the game and my tests show that it gives higher damage per second. For this setup, we need the strongest two-handed mace we can find. For support gems, we use Concentrated Area for more damage, and Fire Attunement for extra fire damage and faster flammability buildup. After you get your first Spirit Gem, pick Herald of Ash. It boosts our main combo, making clearing much faster. If a boss spawns additional monsters, keep them close to the boss to kill him faster. When you get your 5th skill gem, many players switch to Perfect Strike for boss damage. This skill needs good timing, and not everyone likes that playstyle. So, you have 2 options as alternative. Switch to Perfect Strike with Fire Attunement and Window of Opportunity, or just keep using Mace Strike for bosses. These combos are almost everything you needed to clear maps and bosses in Act 1. Before we move on, here are a couple of extra tips. At the very start, we can also pick Frostbomb. It slows enemies and applies exposure so they take more elemental damage. And because Fire Attunement applies burning, we get extra damage from it. We can also run with a totem, but only as a distraction. Drop it to pull aggro from enemies and bosses, so they will switch to it. Also, don't forget to use Raise Shield to block any attack that isn't marked as red. Alright, let's look at the skills and the passive tree we end Act 1 with. By the end of Act, your passive tree is mostly focused on damage, including some extra fire damage to be able to build up flammability. We use the following skills: Mace Strike with Concentrated Area and Fire Attunement, Rolling Slam with Rapid Attacks, Bone Shatter with Impact Shockwave and Magnified Area, Frost Bomb only for the debuff, Shockwave Totem only to distract enemies, and Herald of Ash. And of course we use Infernal Cry as often as possible to add extra fire damage to our attacks. If you want, you can also use Perfect Strike for bosses. Link it with Fire Attunement and Window of Opportunity. In Act 2, you get your first level 2 support gem. At this point, we switch to a new skill setup for clearing. You can use this setup almost all the way into Endgame. For this, we need Shield Charge. It has very high stun buildup. We also link it with the level 2 support gem Brink. Brink greatly increases stun buildup, but this value will never reach 100%. What does this mean in practice? After Shield Charge, enemies are immediately ready for a Bone Shatter hit. So the flow is simple: Shield Charge to set up the stun, then Bone Shatter to finish and clear the pack. At this point, you should already start looking for a shield with higher armor. This will prepare you for Shield Wall later. Shield Wall becomes available as soon as you get your 7th skill gem. From that moment, we start using it for bosses and other tough enemies. For supports, I still prefer to keep it as simple: Concentrated Area and Fire Attunement. But you can also use any other support gems that increase the damage. If you want to understand more about how Shield Wall works and how it deals damage, you can check my previous video with Smith of Kitava Shield Wall build. Now let's continue with Act 2. Do not rush into the Trial of Sekema when you get your first Jin Barya. Warrior is one of the most uncomfortable classes for this trial. We are melee and we have no evasion. Because of that, I recommend doing the Trial of Sekema only right before the final boss of Act 2. In that case, you will be several levels above the monsters in the trial, which will allow you to complete it with ease. For the Ascendancy, I strongly recommend choosing Smith of Kitava. Even if you plan to play a different build later, you can always respec into another Ascendancy after finishing the campaign. Smith of Kitava provides massive survivability bonuses, especially resistances and protection against damaging ailments. For the first 2 Ascendancy points, I recommend taking plus 75% fire resistance and immunity to damaging ailments. High fire resistance and later the rest of elemental resistances in Act 3 makes you extremely hard to kill. Campaign damage is balanced around very low resistances, so it's a huge advantage during the acts. Ailment immunity is also a great bonus, especially against poison in Act 3. Let's take a look at our skills and the passive tree as we finish Act 2. By the end of Act 2, as previously, our passive tree is mostly focused on damage. This tree may look very similar to what we used before. However, there are some important differences. We now focus on global increased attack damage instead of attack damage for a specific weapon type. This is important because our damage comes from the shield. We also want to slightly speed up our skills. Next, we add a source of rage generation. And finally, we start investing into nodes that increase stun buildup and damage against stunned enemies. Let's quickly summarize the skills we use while progressing through the act. Shield Charge with Brink and Stun for instant stun buildup. Bone Shatter with Impact Shockwave and Magnified Area for finishing enemies. Shield Wall with Concentrated Area and Fire Attunement for bosses and dense enemy packs. Shockwave Totem with Urgent Totems and Prolonged Duration to break Shield Wall segments. Infernal Cry with Raging Cry to empower attacks and trigger Shield Wall segments as well. Herald of Ash with Magnified Area for fast clearing. Leap Slam with rapid attacks for fast movement through difficult terrain during the campaign. Now let's move on to Act 3. Here, we continue using the exact same skill setup as in Act 2. We keep looking for a shield with as much armor as possible for shield wall. We also want a one-handed mace with a plus to melee skills modifier. At this point, we also gain access to Fortifying Cry. We link it with Raging Cry just like before. In the Azak Bog, we gain additional 30 Spirit. Here we take Overwhelming Presence for faster stun buildup against bosses and monsters. As you progress through Act 3, you will unlock more gem sockets and gain access to new support gems. But for the rest of the campaign, the exact support gem choices are not very critical, so you can safely use any recommended support gems. My only recommendation would be to add Armor Break for Shield Wall. After completing the Temple of Chaos, we gain 2 more Ascendancy points. We invest them into the node that shares half of our fire resistance with the other elemental resistances. Together with the previously taken plus 75% fire resistance, this gives us almost capped elemental resists with very little investment. Now let's take a look at the passive tree we finish Act 3 with. We invest heavily into the stun branches. This includes increased stun buildup and increased damage against stunned enemies, and additional stun buildup nodes, which work well with the previously taken Overwhelming Presence Spirit Gem. At this point, we also take the Blood Magic Keystone. Since we started experiencing a lack of mana, we switched to using life instead. But be careful when using Blood Magic. If your gear doesn't have Life Leech, I strongly recommend adding Life Leech to Shield Wall to compensate for the life cost. The skill setup remains almost the same as it was in Act 2, so let's move on to Act 4. Act 4 opens up many new gear options. At this point, we gain access to the currency exchange and the market. By the time we reach Act 4, we usually have some amount of exalted orbs that we can spend. The first thing I recommend buying is a Greater Jeweler's Orb. We use it to increase the number of support gem sockets in our main skills, Shield Wall and Bone Shatter. For Shield Wall, we add Rapid Attacks or Life Leech depending on what you need. For Bone Shatter, we add Rapid Attacks and Ancestral Call. Now let's take a look at how to upgrade our gear using the market. You can open the in-game market interface through the extra menu near your flasks. The first thing we want to buy is a shield with higher armor. Armor value directly scales the damage of Shield Wall, so this is our top priority. Select the Shield category. Set the requirements to your current level. In the trade filters, set the maximum price to 1 exalted orb. Click Search, then sort the results by armor value. Perfect! Here is a shield with high armor and fire resistance. That's exactly what we want. Let's buy it. Next, we buy a one-handed mace. Look for a modifier, plus to melee skills. Again, set your level requirement and a reasonable price limit. Increased elemental damage with attacks would be a nice bonus. Now let's buy rings. Since our Ascendancy shares half of our fire resistance with other elemental resistances, we only need to look for fire and chaos resistances. This makes gearing much easier. We should also upgrade our body armor. For Smith of Kitava, look for a normal, also known as white body armor, with the highest possible armor value for your current level. To speed up the campaign, we want boots with the highest possible increased movement speed. For my level, these unique boots are the fastest option. They are a great choice: movement speed, fire resistance, and maximum life. However, I don't want the burning trail effect behind my character, so instead, I'll choose similar rare boots with movement speed and good stats. You can do the same for the rest of your equipment. You might also find a cheap amulet with plus to melee skills. At this point, our gear is in a much better state. Now let's take a look at the passive tree we finish Act 4 with. Compared to the previous act, we further scale strength and the attack bonuses gained from it. We also invest more into closed melee damage. Here is the full skill setup we use at this point. Shield Charge linked with Brink, Stun, and Rapid Attacks. Bone Shatter linked with Impact Shockwave, Magnified Area, Ancestral Call, and Rapid Attacks. Shield Wall linked with Concentrated Area, Fire Attunement, Armor Break, and Life Leech, or Rapid Attacks if you prefer. Shockwave Totem linked with Urgent Totems and Prolonged Duration. Infernal Cry linked with Raging Cry and Tireless. Fortifying Cry linked with Raging Cry and Cooldown Recovery. Leap Slam linked with Rapid Attacks. Herald of Ash linked with Magnified Area. And finally, Overwhelming Presence. At this point, we also have full access to the market. Thanks to the Smith of Kitava Ascendancy, we already have capped all elemental resistances. This works because half of our fire resistance is shared with the other elemental resistances. With that covered, we finish Act 4 and move on to the Interludes. During the Interludes, we continue using the same skill setup. We can also keep using the same gear we bought in Act 4. In the third interlude in Kriar Village, we gain an additional 40 spirit. Here we take Berserk to increase the effect of Rage. As you correctly pointed out in the previous video, Rage provides more attack damage, not only physical damage. At this point, we also replace Overwhelming Presence with Scavenged Plating. This becomes much more useful for us at this stage. We constantly break enemy armor with Shield Wall and Armor Break. Because of that, Scavenged Plating is almost always active. The additional armor it provides becomes extremely important as incoming damage from monsters continues to increase. By the end of the interludes, our passive tree looks like this. We start shifting our focus away from damage nodes only. Instead, we invest more into armor. At this point, monster damage is already similar to endgame levels, so additional defenses become very important. We also replace the earlier small rage cluster with a full rage setup. This increases both our maximum rage and our rage generation. Finally, we take more attack speed nodes. These speed bonuses are very noticeable because we don't get many other sources of attack speed. Aside from these changes, we aim to get the same skill gem setup that I showed in the previous build. Before we move into the endgame, I strongly recommend adding your character to PoE Ninja. This helps you check whether you missed any important bonuses during the campaign. When it comes to passive skill points, there is a simple indicator. If everything is done correctly, each weapon set should have 24 passive points. This means you didn't miss any points during the acts. Finally, we are in the endgame. Before starting our first map, let's quickly upgrade our gear. As you can see, I put together a full start endgame gear set for around 1 Exalted Orb per item. This setup is almost no cost budget. Until we get 65th level, we cannot yet use the unique Giant Maul and Chaos Madness to triple our Shield Wall Fissures. Even without that, Shield Wall is still effective. It's enough for us to get level 65. Once we reach level 65, we can buy our core lineage support gems, An's Citadel and Chaos Madness. At the same time, we can already switch to the unique two-handed Giant Maul, as shown in my previous build guide. To use this weapon, we need 342 strength. Because of that, we also buy additional gear with high strength values. This allows us to take Giant's Blood without any issues. As we gain higher levels and start earning more currency, we begin looking for items that increase our melee skill levels. At this point, we also buy the unique constricting command Viper Cap. This allows us to fully benefit from the passive nodes related to being surrounded. This is a major power spike for both damage and defenses. We should also socket our hammer with runes that increase skill speed. This makes shield wall feel much faster and smoother to use. It is very important to get all 8 Ascendancy points. I'm not a big fan of running Sekema or the Temple of Chaos myself, so I usually buy a carry service. I haven't tested yet, but I think, with a bit more investment, this build can absolutely handle the Temple of Chaos on its own. Once we have all 8 Ascendancy points, we simply follow the build from my previous video. For the fire spell on hit, we use only Detonate Dead for now. As you continue leveling, the passive tree will naturally start to match the final version, shown in the build guide. Now let's see how this low-budget setup with full Ascendancy performs on maps. To move into tier 15 maps, we need to upgrade our shield. We haven't changed it since level 62, so this is a very important step. Here I bought a cheap but strong shield. It gives almost 1000 armor, a lot of life, strength, and fire resistance. Exactly what this build needs. This is the full gear check you are seeing right now. And keep in mind, my character level is still relatively low. Now let's see how this performs. Once we reach level 80 and above, all rare items become available to us. Let's upgrade our gear a bit and take a look at the result. We can continue investing into this build for a very long time. However, the version you're seeing now is the minimal and very affordable baseline. Let's compare how this current setup performs against Xesht compared to a fully min-maxed version. I'm doing this comparison to show that on maps you reach a strong power level very quickly. At the same time, for bossing, this build requires much higher investment. Or possibly a different approach, which I'll continue exploring. There is one more important aspect when preparing for boss fights. Because Kaom's Madness significantly reduces our damage and attack speed, we should adjust our support gems specifically for bosses. For boss encounters, it is recommended to replace the fissure-related support gems. Instead, we use close combat, heft, or rapid attacks. This greatly increases our single target damage. This will also allow to penetrate bigger part of boss's armor, especially if your attack values are still on the lower side. By comparing these two setups, you can roughly estimate the difference in damage. If you use a shield with an armor value somewhere between 1000 and 1600, you can get a very good idea of what damage level to expect. Just remember, the damage of shield wall mainly depends on two things: the level of the shield wall skill gem and the amount of armor on your shield. I also received a lot of questions about whether Uul-Netol's Embrace is worth the cost. So let's compare it with the free alternative, Armor Break 3. Both gems do the same main job, they help us break enemy armor. Uul-Netol's Embrace is a stronger version, but it is also very expensive. Armor Break 3, on the other hand, is completely free and very accessible. It's kind of ironic, right? So let's talk about the boss damage. When I made the previous build guide, I was following my personal priorities. I wanted a build that is strong in maps, fun to play, and feels very smooth thanks to shrine buffs. As in right now, the content I personally care about the most is clearing very difficult juiced maps and farming the hardest versions of the temple, including 800% effectiveness. So the question is, can this build handle the hardest bosses? The answer is yes and no at the same time. The no part comes from how armor works in the game. In most cases, the armor formula does not allow you to scale effective physical EHP much higher than around 10,000. This is a fundamental limitation of armor, and I will talk about it in more detail in a future video. As you can see from the cheap setups shown in this video, this build can comfortably farm difficult tier 15 maps with very little investment. However, to achieve truly massive shield wall damage, you need much more investment than I would personally like. Here, I'm showing a fight against Uber Arbiter. This build is still missing the jewel that gives +3 levels to shield wall, which alone costs around 700 divines. Because of that, I have to play the fight carefully and actually avoid incoming attacks. This build is not about instantly deleting bosses. It's about a strong and fast league start, and about the fun of playing a melee build that feels powerful and smooth. Thank you to everyone who is interested in this build. I truly appreciate every discussion, and I'm really happy that this build brings you fun as well. I'll keep answering your comments, and I wish everyone to find their own perfect build. See you in the next video.